Hello. Today we're going to talk about the concept of cost of quality. Now, this concept, there's roots in work that Duran did. There's roots in Feigenbaum. Most commonly, this concept is attributed to Philip Crosby, and it's likely because he perhaps was more successful popularizing the concept. And in fact, it underlines the key theme, if you will, in his book "Quality is Free," that was published in the late 1970s, which kind of hit the right place, right time sort of thing. Because by that point, U.S. auto manufacturers are really starting to lose out to the Japanese. The Japanese are achieving things that the North American manufacturers have been unable to be able to achieve, and it's kind of in that context that he comes out with this book. I mean, the base premise of it is essentially is that because of the way cost of quality works, all of the various different attributes add together, and the end result is a total cost of quality. Some of that cost is paying for failures. Some of that cost might be doing things to prevent, right? And it's a mix of the two. His contention was you're already paying for poor quality. So if you take some of the money that you're spending today for poor quality and you focus it at prevention and appraisal or activities to try to improve and fix the quality issues, your overall cost of quality will go down. And in fact, those investments that you make for prevention and appraisal are free. So therefore, quality is truthfully a kind of a free thing. So the concept looks at kind of four distinct phases. You have prevention activities, you have appraisal activities, and then you have failure, both internal and external failure categories. One of the things that you'll find is that the farther along you go, the more expensive things become. So particularly when you look at failure. If I catch something internally as a failure, so for example, let's say you do a final inspection and I find that something's not right. At that point in time, I've already put all of my costs into the producing the product up until that point. If I can rework it so that I can make it work and then sell it, that's putting more costs into it, but potentially I'm able to still get something for it. You might B-spec or off-grade at that point, so scratch and dent, things like that fit into that category where you get something for it, but you don't get as much as you would get for the 100% of the product, yet you've got 100% of your costs involved into it. So it's not really a profitability thing. It's about trying to recoup something for the money that you put into it. Same scenario, but if you don't catch it there, instead it ships out to a customer and a customer gets it, and you have to deal with it as a warranty cost. The cost is much higher to you there than it would be if you catch it internally. And you'll find that in the stream and the string that goes through, that holds true, as well as the fact that failures tend to keep happening. Prevention activities, particularly, tend to be one-time type things. So, for example, one of the prevention things. Oops, sorry about that. One of the prevention things that you may do would be if you identify that there's an issue, that there are some employees who don't know how to do something correctly. So I train them to be able to do it correctly, and then I do some follow-up after the training to reinforce that behavioral change. That training was basically a one-time cost, but the benefit that I get from that training goes on into the future. If I don't remedy something that's creating defects, I will just keep getting the defects. And in fact, if you ramp up production, it often gets worse because usually a lot of the root causes that are causing the issue just get exasperated when the volumes go up. So it's a method that you use to show financial impact, right? And that's one of the big parts of the quality stuff, is because this is not about a goodliness or ethical, or, and although it does have those implications, this is an argument that is factually and financially based. you attach dollar values to various different activities, right? So dollar values to what the failure costs are, but also dollar values to appraisal and prevention activities. And you add them all up. And as I said before, the total gives you a total cost of quality. The goal is to continue to do things to drive that overall number down as low as possible. Obviously, the goal is zero. You'll never get to zero, but you're trying to get as close as you can to achieving that. So most companies don't gather this information today. So costs are not usually identified in financial records. Like defects, they get buried in cost of goods sold usually. Um, you may or may not be able to tease them out of the existing information that's there. Some of the external failure stuff will be fairly easy to get your hands around. So warranty costs and stuff like that often are. The truth is there are other failure costs, like external failure costs, that you really can't quantify. So for example, if I had produced a product and it was defective and you got it and you were pissed off with the fact that you got a defective product, even if I replace it or I refund you or whatever, you may still be pissed off about the experience and you'll never buy from me again. And you may try to encourage other people not to buy from me again. So there are certainly implications in the external failure area that can be very difficult to quantify. And we'll look at a couple of more extreme examples, if you will, later, where you'll see that really usually when you examine these situations, it's the external failure category that by far is the largest dollar value that's there. Most organizations aren't aware of the cost to produce non-quality. So there was a quote that we had earlier in one of the presentations about that, companies pay people to make mistakes. And most cases, they're not aware of their cost to produce non-quality. So the first step in this process is that you have to gather the information. So you start to gather, so, what are our internal failures costing us? What's the external failure stuff costing us? What are we spending in appraisal? What are we spending in prevention? And in most companies, when you first start to do this, prevention and appraisal are probably not particularly big. There'll be lots of debates about, oh my God, the number couldn't possibly be that high when you look at the failure stuff, because most organizations conceptually will have a difficulty getting their head around the fact that they have so much waste that's coming about from stuff having to be reworked or scrapped or any of the rest of that. And once you've set that basis, what's important is that you continue to track all of those categories, and then you're very consciously focused at doing specific things to have an influence on your failure costs. So when you look at for example, look at some of the internal failures that are going on, you'd want to examine to go, well, why are they happening? So why am I seeing this particular issue? And you want to get to the root cause. And then your prevention activities are focused on the root cause. Is it a material issue? Does it have to do with the process? Does it have to do with training? Does it have to do with whatever it does? That's the thing that you focus your prevention activity on. And I go back to one of the things that you'll find is that prevention activities tend to be one-time events. Appraisal is an important piece in cooperation with your prevention activity. Appraisal is relative to the results that you achieve. So as you do a better job, your appraisal costs can go down. Appraisal, commonly one of the, not the only attribute, but commonly one of the categories in appraisal is inspection. So the first thing that a lot of places will do once they potentially identify their quality issues is they start inspecting a bunch of stuff. And inspection is good because it tells you have a problem, it tells you where, it tells you how much, but it doesn't do anything to fix the problem. And in fact, it is a cost. So one of the things that you're ultimately trying to do is to reduce that inspection cost down as low as you reasonably can go. And that only happens when your prevention activities are having lasting benefits in the organization. And you'll always have some appraisal and always should have some, but ultimately keep in mind the goal overall is to drive your total cost of quality down as low as possible. And you do that by eliminating the failures and being judicious in the investments that you make in appraisal and prevention activities. So internal failure, it's something that happens before it's delivered to the customer, right? So it's still within your environment. Now, internal failure captured at the beginning of a process is far less expensive than internal failure caught at the end of the process. And it's one of the reasons why you'll find um, when you look at like a manufacturing line setup, there are multiple different places where they will do inspections. And sometimes it's 100% inspection, sometimes it's a representative sample inspection. And the stages and the places where they choose to do it reflect changes in the manufacturing process, but they also reflect kind of distinct parts where if I caught something here, there's very tangible things I could do about resolving the issue before it becomes worse. And that's ultimately what you're trying to do is if you catch something, catch it before it becomes worse and catch it in a time period and in a phase where it's still actionable. If I'm doing electronics and I'm doing it on a circuit board, if I wait till the boards come out of the reflow oven, it's too late. I mean, I practically can't do anything about a component issue at that point in time. Um, yes, you can micro solder and have somebody go through and pull things off and test them and stuff, but the cost you would have involved in having somebody do that would outweigh the benefits of doing it. So what happens is by that point, if you have an issue, it's scrap for the most part. Um, One of the ways to prevent that is have your incoming inspection of the components before they get put onto the board. Now, that won't eliminate any potential issue that might happen. If the solder doesn't flow properly in the reflow oven, you could still have an issue. If for whatever reason it wasn't laid out properly, you could still have an issue. You could, and there are some early life failure issues that will come up later on. But as much as possible, your incoming inspection would prevent the issues over here. That reduces your costs very much so. Your external failure stuff is when it gets out into the wild, so to speak, and it gets to customers. And as I said, that's where you see the huge dollar value, huge impact activities, because it's not, and it's often not just money, like it's reputation, it's a bunch of other things. When you watch the video that's included with these materials, where they go through the various different examples, right? So they go through the Challenger example, and they talk about Toyota, and they talk about the oil platform in the Gulf. Those are all great examples of what would have been a fairly inexpensive thing, relatively speaking, to have dealt with. And had they dealt with it ahead of time, could have avoided massive, massive, massive costs and usually loss of life and all these other pieces. There's a Prezi that I've included that some students at Algonquin College had done on a Canadian company called Lululemon. So that's a good thing for it to follow through as well, because it kind of talks about the experience that they had and what the issue was with the company, which ended up being the fabric ended up being more sheer than it was supposed to be. But then it's really a good real world example because the founder of the company actually makes the issue much, much, much worse, because instead of owning the problem, which is ultimately what they should have done, he blames his customers and says, well, women are buying the wrong sizes, and their thighs are too fat and they're rubbing. Like he makes it way, 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 way worse for themselves out of the whole thing because of how they dealt with it. So you want to make sure that you do watch and go through both of those pieces to get a better sense of this. Oops, sorry. Appraisal are costs associated with measuring, evaluating, or auditing, right? So it's most commonly inspection, and prevention are the things that you do to prevent those issues from happening. And ultimately what you're trying to do is you got to figure out what's causing the problems, and then you deal with them one by one, right? Which is a very Six Sigma kind of approach. And as I said, your prevention things tend to be one-time costs. And you use your appraisal as a way of checking, did I get the behavioral change or the process change that I was looking to do by the prevention activity that I did? So the more you resolve your issues, the less your appraisal costs end up being. So you can reduce both of those fairly substantially. And if the net result is that you reduce failures, then you reduce your failure costs, which is how you reduce that overall number, fairly substantially. So you see in the table here, Examples of prevention costs, right? Which is planning and engineering, new product review, process control, burn-in for electrical components. As I mentioned before, early life failure is usually where you have problems with them. You can avoid it by burning the components in by, for the 72 hours or whatever the number is that you have to do ahead of time. It's a cost, but if I find an issue with a component during burn-in, and it's before I've actually manufactured something, it's far, far less expensive to deal with than to build the board and I test it at the end and find out that this capacitor is no good. And like I said, with most board designs today, with the level of integrated circuits and everything else in it, and the surface mount structure that's used, by the time it comes at the other end, if there's a problem, you're scrapping the board. And so you got 100% of your board costs in, but you got to basically throw it all away. Right? You might get some recovery for the metals and stuff like that, but basically it's all down the tube. Your appraisal, right? Inspection, and that's both it's inspection and test of incoming, right? Which is really, really important. Like I said, if you test stuff before you introduce the manufacturing environment, that's the best place to find a problem, because then you haven't added any value to those things. It's when you start adding value through manufacturing and other things that you do, and then discover that there's an issue, it's oops, right? So ultimately in your appraisal, what you wanna do is your inspection or appraisal place wants to be as close to where you're likely to see the defect, right? Which is why I said there's very thoughtful stages about where you do these activities. Failure costs internally, scrap, rework, retest, failure analysis. There's downtime often as a result of it. Yield losses, so we're not making as many out of the materials that we expected to. I mentioned off-speccing, right, or downgrading, or scratch and dent, or B-stock, or whatever you want to call it, where you've got 100% your costs in, but you'll never get 100% of your value back out of it. At least you get something from it. And then, as I said, the external failure costs tend to be the highest category. When you're actually fixing stuff that's out in the wild, your costs are significantly higher. There's often complaint adjustment things that are additional. If you go to a restaurant and you order a meal and the meal shows up and they've done a shitty job, they've brought you the wrong thing, or it's cold, or they didn't cook it enough, or something like that, they're going to have to make that right. But in the same token, they're probably going to go, oh, I'm sorry. And they'll, well, we'll give you desserts complimentary. They'll do whatever. Those complaint adjustment pieces can be a significant part of those failure costs. And then liability and other indirect costs, which you'll see particularly in some of those examples that are in the video, become very, very, very significant and very, very large. Now, they don't all. Just because I have a quality issue and it gets out and it becomes an issue, externally, there are costs involved to it. They don't necessarily become catastrophic. The challenge for the organization is that the things that would make it go catastrophic are outside of your control. So when you get to the assignment that you're doing, that you do on Maple Leaf Foods, it was around a listeria outbreak. So listeria is a bacteria that's a common issue in food processing. It's tough to deal with because it's very temperature resistant. There's no, taste, touch, smell. Like it's very difficult to identify it. So it is a challenge they have, and they've had it periodically, unfortunately, even since the big notable outbreak in 2008. But the implications and the costs of the one in 2008 far outstrip everything else. And the difference between the two of them, certainly there's some circumstantial differences, but a lot of it is driven by things that were outside of the company, right? They were circumstances that made it much, much worse than it might otherwise have been. And like I said, so you as the company don't get to pick the circumstances, so whether your oops is a little oops or whether your oops becomes a really big oops. Overall, as I mentioned before, the goal of the system is to reduce your total cost of quality. So prevention plus appraisal plus failure costs equals something. Whatever that total is, you're trying to drive that number down as low as possible. And on the broad strokes, the way that you do it is you identify the problems that are creating the failures. You remedy them through prevention activities, which tend to be one-time activities. You ensure that you've got the fixes and the fixes stay in place by ongoing appraisal activities. But how much you appraise and the costs involved in the appraisal, you can continue to refine to make it less expensive to do, right? So one of the examples in a manufacturing environment, it's very common, particularly in just-in-time inventory systems, is that you'll push incoming inspection to your supplier. So, when the tires show up for the, to the gate for the shift that we're going to use to build that particular vehicle, instead of us inspecting the tires before we put them into the process, they're inspected by the manufacturer before they leave their facility. That pushes the cost down to them. It also means that they're not shipping things that are defective. So it doesn't mean I don't have to ship things back. It also means I don't have to have floor space in my facility to do incoming inspection. I also don't have to have people in my facility doing incoming inspection, right? You ensure they're doing those inspections based on an audit system with them, but you push that activity down to them. So there are creative ways that you can make sure that the appraisal stuff still gets done, but they're not necessarily things that you have to directly do yourself. Now, when you're first looking at implementing one of these programs, you have to justify the need. And what happens is usually, as I said, the first thing is that companies are not usually gathering this information. So you first have to gather and focus on the failure part, right? So what are external failures costing us? What are internal failures costing us? What are we spending in appraisal? What are we spending in prevention? As I said, if you're not proactively doing stuff, your prevention is probably very little, if any. Your inspection is probably fairly little as well, but the first thing people won't believe how big the failure numbers are, because they just conceptually won't understand that it's that big of an issue that they were just ignoring, right? And as I said, usually it gets rolled up under your gross margin, so it just ends up being a higher cost, but it gets buried in there. So it's when you separate it out and you see it for what it is that it usually becomes a lot more manifest. And then you go, okay, well, we're spending this much for failure. So let's start with even just spending half of that money aimed at a specific prevention, and then the requisite, appraisal activity to make sure that what we did was correct. And again, you have to identify what's causing your problems. If I identify a problem with a process, then let's rework the process, test the process, and then by the process implementation, we should see a reduction in the defects, right? So it's driven by, what do I actually find here? What activities do I do to eliminate that? How do I ensure that those activities or behavioral changes have taken place with my appraisal? And then ultimately, you're measuring based on the ultimate results. Early on, one of the first things that you can do is start inspecting 100% of stuff before it leaves your facility. And then that can turn the tap off to a large extent for your external failures. And as I said, your external failures will be the most expensive things that you have. So one of the first easy things you can do is I inspect 100% of stuff before it leaves. Now, should you be doing that ongoing? Maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. It really depends on your environment and a variety of things that are going on. But it is an early first step to kind of stop the gate from making it worse. Keep in mind, inspection doesn't fix anything, right? It just potentially prevents something from getting worse. So your cost collection, as I said, because most of these figures won't be actively being gathered today. When you start doing it, ultimately it's the responsibility of the finance department. It may require some modifications to accounting systems. It's probably the extent of that you're creating some accounts in your general ledgers to keep these separately, because to some extent these costs are reflected in your business already. Like I said, they're just rolling up under other things at the moment. They're not broken out specifically. Using your results, right? So when you find, oh my God, I can't believe that that it's costing us, $100,000 a quarter just in internal failures. So you go, great, okay. So one of the things that you'd want to do, and when you think of the quality tool kind of stuff, what kind of failures are we seeing? What are the biggest, right? So the most significant, the most numerous failures that we're seeing that are part of that 100,000. What are the root causes for it? What kinds of things should we resolve? What kind of things can we do to resolve those root causes of those issues? And then as a budgeting tool and targeting, you go, well, I mean, there's $100,000 worth of stuff going on. And if we find that there's, a particular issue that is causing 50% of those issues, right? Heck, that's $50,000 a quarter that's attributable to that particular issue. So even if we take $10,000, and focus it at a specific prevention activity, and then requisite, appraisal stopgap to it, the focus is to reduce that 50,000 that was happening before. And if we do that, not only does it reduce it for that quarter, but it should continue to reduce it quarter after quarter after quarter after quarter. So overall, it's really important that this stuff is quantified financially, right? Because this is about the financial impact of the business. Absolutely, there are reputational impacts, there are ethical impacts, there are a bunch of others, and I'm not saying they're not important, but the way this gets sold is the language of money. And just measuring it doesn't fix the problems, right? Because just measuring it to some degree is an appraisal kind of activity. It tells you the problem, it tells you the degree, the extent. It may even give you some good insights into what might be actually causing things. In itself doesn't fix stuff. In an extent, that doesn't fix stuff. You have to actually take action, and the way to take action is to understand what the root causes are. The traditional quality cost, right? Over time, you want to look at expanding the scope, particularly the external failure elements, right? Reputational damage, things like that. If you have a fairly, your business reputation is built on the experiences that people have with your products and services and your company overall. Your brand can be an incredibly valuable thing, and usually is. The hit your brand takes based on poor quality is very, very tangible. It may be more difficult to measure, although there's lots of ways to measure value of a brand. And frankly, that should be part of your cost of quality costs, is the impact, like the negative impact to the value of your brand overall.